Unabashed.
The most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives,
a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan and Jessica of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. In 2018, the World Health Organization published a list of the 15 most polluted cities in the world. 14 of the 15 were in India. This is a troubling statistic that's been repeated ad nauseam in the media, by environmental advocates, and by concerned citizens of the country. But what are the causes of this environmental crisis? What are the social costs? And what, if anything, can be done about it? Joining me to talk about India's battle for clean air is Jessica Seddon. Jessica is the global lead for air quality at the World Resources Institute here in Washington. She is also a non-resident fellow down the street at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, also a research fellow at Princeton University. She has spent more than a decade living and working in India on issues related to urbanization, infrastructure, the environment, and decentralization. And she spent most of that time living outside of the bubble of Delhi, ensconced in sunny Chennai, which gives her a unique perspective on what's happening in India. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm always happy to talk about air quality and Chennai.
So I want to begin by asking you about definitions. When we talk about air pollution in India, or anywhere else for that matter, what exactly are we talking about and how do we measure its extent?
That's a great question. Most of the time when you see media reports about air pollution, people are talking about particulate matter of various sizes. The smaller, the worse. I think the next big dimension of air pollution that's going to be hitting the headlines is ozone, ground level ozone. Beyond that, when you look at the regulatory side, the more technical discourse, there are actually a larger set of what are called criteria pollutants, gases and particles in the air that are damaging for health. Even beyond that, there's a whole group of pollutants called air toxics, which are usually not regulated, but also something of concern. So depends how technical you want to be.
So when the World Health Organization puts out a list of the 15 most polluted cities in the world, what are they actually measuring? How do they determine what's 1 and what's 15?
They're actually looking at mostly particulate matters and at cities that exceed the recommended safe levels of particulate matter. I think the map of the most polluted cities in the world would actually look really different if we started to also look at ozone, air toxics, and the other matters of health concern.
I want to ask you about the social costs of air pollution in India particularly, and you wrote a blog post last year in which you said the following. Quote, most of the rising global attention to air pollution focuses on the impacts that ozone, particulate matter, and other pollutants have on human health. Growing public awareness of the health consequences is encouraging, but we need to look at the bigger picture of what air pollution is doing to our planet and to ourselves. So tell us a bit about what the elements are of this bigger picture in your view.
Sure. And here's where the science is really quite firm and pretty striking. So if you look just at the big two parts of air pollution, so if you look just at particulate matter and ozone, some of the other impacts include extensive crop damage. So the haze dims the sunlight that reaches the crops. Ozone also actually damages crops. And the level of crop loss that we're seeing even now is pretty striking. So 15% loss globally for wheat and soy as of 2000, probably more now. For some Indian varieties, the numbers are even more striking. 25% crop loss for wheat, up to 50% for cotton, 25% loss for rice. This is just yield that we never see on top of the effects of drought or soil or anything else. And those numbers add up. Second, the impact of air pollution on the water cycle. So it affects the way water moves around, the way clouds form, the regularity of the monsoon. All of that is something that also is very well established in the science. It's not as much in the headlines. There's the impact on renewable energy. Obviously, when you dim, not as much energy reaches the solar panels. Some of the estimates coming from China and India are a quarter of the yield is lost. And then last, on climate, air pollution also contributes to warming and to some extent a masking or a slight cooling prevention of heat reaching the surface.
So, we can't reduce air pollution's negative impacts just to its negative or adverse health impacts alone. But of course, those health impacts are very real. You've written elsewhere that, if you breathe in dirty air, it's affecting more than just your lungs and causes more than just premature death. How else it is affecting our health? Well,
I think one of the frustrating things is when we talk about air pollution affecting premature death, people tend to think, oh, that's way in the future. It won't happen to me. It sort of puts it at a distance. But when you look at the research, and you look at its effect on everyday health, on your cognitive function, on your chances of developing dementia, on premature birth, on fetal health, on child health, on fertility, on your everyday lung function, on your quality of life, that is where the numbers start to get much more scary and much more immediate.
But many of these impacts you're talking about are not things that are necessarily visible or that appear in the short term, right? I mean, these are things that could have debilitating lifelong consequences.
Well, they appear in the short term in terms of sick days. They appear in the short term in terms of childhood asthma. They appear in terms of effects on pregnancy and on premature birth. So they're indistinguishable in the sense that you don't immediately think, oh, that's air pollution, I'm feeling groggy today, but they're real.
So I want to come back to the startling WHO statistic I cited at the outset. When you look at the list, 14 of the 15 most polluted cities in the world are not just in India, they are all in North India, one particular section of the country. And I'm wondering, why is this pollution crisis, if we can call it that, so geographically bounded in one particular region of the country?
Well, I think first, I do want to emphasize that map is a function of, number one, what's measured. And not every city in India has air quality that's measured. And second, that it's based on particulate matter rather than other forms of air pollution that can also be damaging. So given that, one of the reasons is that North India actually acts like a large holding basin for pollution. So everything that's emitted across the Indo-Gangetic Plain, everything that comes from household burning, from auto rickshaws, from agricultural burning, from really almost any other source that you can think of, backs up against the Himalayas and has nowhere to go. When you couple that with something called the inversion layer, where a layer of warm air sits on top of the cold air and basically traps in the pollution, you have a recipe for almost gas chamber.
So when the chief minister of Delhi calls Delhi a virtual gas chamber, it's actually literally a gas chamber because of geography and the way the geography impacts the air that people breathe.
Yeah, I mean, Los Angeles has a similar type of geography, and that's why in the U.S. the pollution crisis got much worse there than it did elsewhere. Mexico City is in a similar kind of basin. I mean, the fact is North India really needs to be one giant low-emission zone in order to be able to achieve breathable air, in large part because of its geography, and that makes it harder.
So I want to come back to LA and Mexico City when we talk about solutions, but coming back to India for a second, you lived in Chennai for a long time. I'm sure, as many other South Indians or South Indian residents, you will agree with me that Delhi gets far more attention than it deserves based on its size alone. However, when it comes to the issue of pollution, it does in some ways appear to be kind of ground zero in the public imagination. I think most of our listeners are familiar with the annual cycle of stories that appear in the global press about how, every winter Delhi appears to be this unlivable gas chamber or kind of toxic zone. And one question I get a lot from friends and family that I have no expertise in answering is the following. How can we break down the air pollution crisis in terms of its culprits? Because you hear that there's so many factors, right? There's vehicle emissions, there's crop burning in neighboring states like Punjab, there's industrial pollution. I'm sure there's lots of other causes I haven't mentioned. So how do we apportion blame if we were to kind of decompose what the effect would look like?
Well, I think when you're looking at it is how do we apportion blame, you sort of come around to everybody. Because the answer is, the contributors to Delhi's pollution are all of the above and more. So waste burning is something you didn't mention, but is also something that's established. Ammonia coming from excess fertilizer use, wind patterns. It really is everything and everybody. So when you're in a situation like that, where every action that people are taking as part of their moving around, producing things, or anything else, I think it's much more constructive to start to look at who can do what to start to fix the problem and to apportion almost responsibility based on who has the power to act now to get started. And some of those things are within the city, just disposing of solid waste, doing something other than burning, backup diesel gensets, actually complying with the laws about vehicle emissions, making sure the pollution under control certificates are not only up to date, but actually really tested. Those kinds of things are things that people can do. They can switch their transport choices. They can actually support public transportation, as inconvenient as it is now. that is probably one of the solutions within the city. The city itself can invest further in waste management. It can invest further in managing some of the traffic congestion. But ultimately, you also need a national investment, fuel standards, a faster transition away from coal into renewable energy. Everybody, the point I'm trying to make is that everybody has a role to play. And to some extent, waiting for the blame to be fully apportioned rather than without reversing that question to what can I do to get started, I don't see an answer to it anywhere in the next years to decades.
But one of the narratives that has taken hold in the media, and it's popular amongst politicians in Delhi, is we can't do much to stop this problem because it has to do with stubble burning that takes place in bordering states, namely Punjab and Haryana. And because it has a seasonal tinge to it, we're just kind of stuck, and it's a collective action problem. And unless someone else, namely leaders of those two states, takes action, then we can't really do anything. Is that too simplistic of a narrative in your view?
Yeah, that is too simplistic. I mean, it is fair to blame actions outside of Delhi. I mean, depending on what season, anywhere from 30 to 50% of the pollution is coming from outside. However, some of the highest exposure areas and some of the most health damaging areas are completely controllable within the city through city level action on waste management, traffic, transport, et cetera. So I think it's disingenuous to blame it entirely on what's happening outside the city.
So I want to ask you about Delhi's actions and what they can do, specifically about this controversial odd-even policy in which cars were allowed on the roads on certain days of the week, depending on whether their license plates ended in odd or even numbers. And this is one experiment that has gotten a lot of airtime, a lot of oxygen, I'm sure, in your world, as well as generally in the press and elsewhere. But I'm curious whether now, with the benefit of hindsight, you think this odd-even experiment was a high-profile stunt, or did it actually have some demonstrable positive impacts on the quality of air?
Well, it had one very clear benefit of demonstrating what the streets look like when they're less congested. And I think people really appreciated that, and it opened up a lot of a sense of possibility of what Delhi could be like with less traffic. On pollution, well, the most of the studies on particulate matter show that it seemed to have some effect, not a big effect, and also, I think, unfortunately, politically, more of a better than it could have been rather than a demonstrable, immediate, visible impact to the public. And I think that highlights one of the challenges with air quality management is that you can do nothing and have it rain and all of a sudden have clear air. You can do everything and have the wind shift and have your neighbor's pollution make it even more polluted than before. So in terms of responding to it politically, you need those kind of really performative, visible actions, even if they're not necessarily the most cost-effective to respond to a demand for clean air that doesn't have sufficient information about what are the real sources and what are the most effective actions. I think also, the other thing that it illustrates is that going with something that is more performative than necessarily designed to be effective based on the science means that you sometimes make mistakes, because the odd-even policy actually was probably worse for ozone by shifting the traffic peaks in a way that they contributed to additional ozone against the background of atmospheric chemistry. So I think in some ways the two lessons to take away are, one is Delhi can be really nice with less congestion, and two, scientists are your friends in designing effective policy. And three, in some ways there needs to be more of a public education about what are the sources and what will it take to reduce them, so that we're not limited to these kind of very performative responses to what is a crisis and what people really do, what people are really increasingly up in arms about.
So I'm conscious that thus far we've focused largely on cities. You are a scholar of cities. Much of what I read comes from cities. But does this reflect a kind of urban bias that we tend to focus too much on cities when we talk about the air pollution issue? Is that focus on cities at the expense of rural areas justified?
In a utilitarian sense of where are the most people being exposed, yes. In a human sense, absolutely not. If you look at any measure of air pollution across northern India and across other parts of India, the ground monitoring is mostly concentrated in cities, but what we can tell from satellite and other data, the air pollution knows no boundaries. And I think some of the groups that are blamed, it's not as if the farmers who are burning their fields don't understand that their children too are also affected. And I think we need to recognize the importance of rural as well as urban air pollution, particularly when we're looking at indoor air pollution and the groups that are exposed to air pollution mainly through their efforts to keep their households running. That's a group that I think we need to not let drop off the radar screen.
And when we talk about indoor air pollution, you're primarily referencing kind of traditional methods of cooking that rely on burning wood or burning dung or things like that?
Yeah, that's a big contributor to indoor air pollution in rural areas. There's a whole other chemistry of indoor air pollution in urban areas. But in terms of particulate matter, yes, it's traditional cooking.
So I want to transition now to talking about solutions. And I'm wondering what specifically cities in India can do to tackle this pressing challenge of air pollution. And, you mentioned earlier that you have cities that are embedded within states, embedded within the union, obviously. Is it just a question of trying to get greater fiscal transfers from the central and state government? In other words, just more money? Or do we need to think about a different set of solutions for cities to kind of solve this problem?
I think we need to think about the problem differently. I mean, right now, a lot of the attention and the money for air pollution control is considered to be something that goes into the pollution control boards and into the Ministry of Environment, Forest, and Climate Change and into sort of the environmental regulatory complex. But really, if you look at what it's going to take to reduce air pollution and to reduce the emissions that contribute to it, you need to look at this as a infrastructure and services transition. And that means that the agencies that are currently managing waste, overseeing public transport investment, allocating between different types of buses or between other forms of public transport, enforcing construction norms, those agencies need to have both the money and the authority to act in the interest of air pollution. And I think one of the things that I've written about in a couple of places is that sometimes when commissioners or chief engineers or people are trying to justify their budgets, they often see improvements that cost a little more but could have pretty significant air quality impacts. Segregated waste trucks, for example, could really improve the air by reducing both the burning as well as some of the methane emissions. They cost a little extra. What would it take to empower those agencies to make the case for the additional investment in terms of air quality returns and to access some of the funding that's coming in for air quality management in a different way for everyday urban development, urban infrastructure, and services? That's, I think, the shift that we need to make to ensure that the more money actually goes into constructive solutions.
So you've made the point elsewhere, Jessica, that, India's clean air goals can't be separated from individual sectoral policies, say policies on agriculture, policies on heavy industry, on chemicals, but that they also can't be seen as simply a regulatory fix. They have to be integrated in some sense horizontally into a variety of different sectoral strategies. To what extent are we seeing this kind of thinking kind of take root in India right now?
Well, I think there's this kind of thinking, but we're pretty far away from having this thinking be actually implementable. So in terms of the kind of policy discourse, the kind of stuff that shows up in op-eds, in the Finance Commission report, in policy memos, there is a recognition that this is very tied up in decisions about energy, decisions about transportation, et cetera. But actually making those public investments contingent on their air quality impact or prioritizing based on their air quality impact, that is not done, and there's really no possibility to do that until we have a better ability to quantify what are the air quality returns on particular choices. And I think in order to do that, we need a kind of champion to take that on. We need an integrative group, something like the Niti Aayog, the Prime Minister's office, an empowered group of ministers to actually take on the challenge of identifying within the Ministry of Urban Development. What are the pieces that could deliver air quality returns and not just treat this as a regulatory matter?
So I want to ask you about data. Several times on this podcast in previous episodes, we've talked about the kind of credibility crisis, frankly, facing lots of data and statistical systems in India. As you know better than I, this has impacted everything, from GDP growth to consumption to even fiscal finances. I want to ask you about data in the realm that you care about, which is air pollution. To what extent is data and its reliability a constraint in developing kind of meaningful, lasting solutions?
Well, we definitely know enough to act. At a high level, we know what the list of to-dos are, and I think we really don't need too much more data for that. Where the data gaps do bind, however, are in the management of implementation and in politics. So in implementation, without data, you're kind of limited on how you can actually follow through on that wish list all the way down through the different layers of decisions about public investment, decisions about agency-level goals, and also in terms of policy instruments. So it's impossible to have a air quality contingent transport plan unless you have the data to evaluate different transport plans on what are their air quality returns. It's very hard to move to any form of the policy instrument for interstate compensation without being able to quantify in a way that both states agree how much of the air pollution came from one state versus the other. The less data you have, the more assumptions, the more guesswork, the more room for disagreement. With enforcement, similarly, it's very hard to enforce all the way down to the plant or the industry level unless you have the data to do so. So that's where it's kind of a management and implementation constraint. Similarly, on politics, part of the whole challenge with air pollution is to be able to show that what you're doing that's generally inconvenient actually delivers air quality returns.
For your constituents.
For your constituents. And if you don't have the data to do that, or if you have data that's very easily contestable, it's very hard to quantify progress and to maintain political support for what on a day-to-day basis is generally experienced as some degree of inconvenience. And those are the two places where I think the data gap really binds.
And do you think, Jessica, that we are seeing the emergence of air pollution, of environment and climate-related issues kind of on the political agenda? You've been following this issue for a long time. One question that people always say is, people are literally dying. They can't breathe. They can't see. Why aren't they using this to hold politicians accountable at the ballot box? Are we seeing a change in the way that people are reacting, talking about this in India?
So I think we're seeing a change in the level of attention. It's come up at the top of a polling issue in a survey I saw in Chandigarh. More MPs are asking, more members of parliament are asking questions about it. But it's hard to hold somebody accountable for delivering clean air when the act of delivering clean air means that you have to rearrange transportation, waste, agriculture, industry, and energy. And I think until we are able to have a realistic conversation about what it will take and to see benefits from making hard choices, it's going to be very hard to take what's an irritant into a sustained policy and political action.
And presumably there's also this attribution problem, right? Is it your local government? Is it your urban local body? Is it your state government, the central government? Is it the bureaucracy? Who is responsible for taking the critical actions to actually tackle the pollution issue?
Right. And that's not just India. We did a study of the political economy of air pollution around the world, and it really almost always falls apart at attribution, not just of responsibility, but of sources, because that's the part where within the science you have to make the most assumptions, where the models are really important, and those who are creating the pollution often point the fingers at others and can find a study that seems to be competing. It's the place where the obfuscation happens the most, is around that attribution.
So I want to ask you about a report that you led on behalf of WRI and that you submitted to the 15th Finance Commission in India, in which you and your colleagues looked at possible success stories in pollution reduction. And I think two of the examples you referred to are Los Angeles and Mexico City. You mentioned both those cities earlier. Obviously, these are really different contexts from, say, Delhi or Lucknow or Patna. But what are some of the key lessons learned, you think, from these cases that might inform the approaches that Indian policymakers could take?
Sure. And actually, we looked at three cases. Los Angeles and the greater Los Angeles area, the South Coast Air Quality Management District, Mexico City, as you mentioned, and also the Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution Convention in Europe, which is between European nations. And the reason that we looked at those three is that, first, even though these contexts may seem disparate now, India is not alone in having a pollution challenge. In 1943, visibility in Los Angeles was 3 blocks. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, birds were literally dying and falling from the sky in Mexico City. It was the most polluted city in the world in the early 1990s. And in Europe, there was a visible political backlash against fish and trees that were being damaged by acid rain related to air pollution in the 70s. So this isn't distant history. It's a while ago, but India is not alone in having a pollution problem, and all of these places are much better now. The second point that we wanted to make is that institutions aren't always perfect or promising when they start, and that some of the most effective institutional arrangements for addressing air pollution now actually started in a very messy way. The Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution Convention started as a place to talk. The Metropolitan Commission in Mexico City had no budget, no real authority, a plan that they were supposed to magically integrate across, I think, 17 different agencies, and about 15 senior political officials who started out by squabbling. The South Coast Air Quality Management District had 4 counties, 4 agencies that never really talked to each other. But over time, they have all become, in a relatively limited time, they've all become effective institutions because as they started to address some sources, the popular support and the budget support and the political support for doing more grew. And so the point was really, you don't have to start perfectly in order to get started. And the last point that we wanted to make that to come out of these studies was that scientists are your friends. In terms of being able to show cost-effective ways to achieve your health goals, when you get stuck and whatever you're doing is not reducing your particulate matter or ozone anymore, as what happened in Mexico, sometimes actually commissioning scientists to do some forensic work on what are the sources can help you get restarted again. And I think the point is in all 3 of these arrangements, there have been different ways to bring in scientists in ways that ultimately delivered much cleaner air at lower cost than had been anticipated. So as to give a way to sort of people have done this before, you can too.
I think scientists are your friends. We need that, slogan maybe to be raised a little bit more in our own country. I want to end by asking you a question about international cooperation. Now, India has signed up to what it believes are fairly ambitious domestic targets as part of the Paris Climate Change Accord. It has taken a lot of pride in being part of the solution rather than part of the problem. India has had this reputation of being a kind of obstructionist party, preventing global agreements. They have prided themselves on being more constructive. Do we have a sense of how well India is doing in terms of meeting some of the targets that it set out in Paris?
Well, I think that it's important to keep in mind that even though India has often sort of pointed out that it's the 4th largest emitter, in terms of emissions per capita, it's well below the world average. Indians emit something like 1.9 metric tons per person. The world average is 5. And in the U.S., we emit 16 metric tons per person. So in terms of where it is right now, I think it's kind of unfair to call it part of the problem. The second is that in terms of participating in international agreements, it continues to be constructive. India joined the Climate and Clean Air Coalition in July 2019, which is a coalition of the willing, in some sense, of countries that are willing to jointly tackle clean air and climate goals together. Now, in terms of the 3 pledges that it made for reduced emission intensity of growth, for a faster shift to renewable energy, and for an increase in forest cover, I think with emission intensity, that seems to be on track. I think that the economic slowdown It'll be interesting to see where that takes both overall emissions as well as the intensity. On renewables, the same old troubles that have plagued anything that you want to do in the power sector seem to be getting in the way of an additional ramp-up of renewables, things like a relatively bankrupt distribution sector, some of the regulatory hurdles. So the shift to renewables and away from coal has not been as fast as I think had been intended. But it's still underway, and I think we'll see. I don't see any sort of major enduring obstacles to that. And on forest cover, the 15th Finance Commission has just increased the reward to states for maintaining forest cover, and there is some degree of attention to continuing to ensure that forest cover is actually higher quality, more carbon absorbing. So
just to clarify on that, what that means is the share of funds that will be devolved from the center to the states as determined by the Finance Commission, part of that formula includes forest cover. And what this commission has done is to increase the weightage of forest cover in that formula? Yeah,
it's increased. So the commission has only released its first-year report, as you know. But in that first-year report, the weight is now 10%. That in and of itself is, I think, an indicator of a constructive and positive disposition toward improving forest cover.
So last but not least, we're sitting here in Washington. I want to ask you about the role of the United States. We have our own issues with the global climate change regime. There's one political party which is very skeptical about climate change being a man-made issue. But leaving that aside, what are concrete ways in which the United States can help India and Indian cities in particular with the air pollution challenges that they face?
So I think there are two things I want to say about that. One is that I think in the kind of technical cooperation, support from agencies like USAID or others, I think we need to work with the cities to help them achieve their own goals, rather than starting from the perspective of assisting in climate or air quality action planning. So simply inverting the question of how can you achieve what you want for your constituents and people in terms of economic, social, human development at the lowest climate cost and with the best air possible, that kind of approach, I think, is far more constructive and useful and actually meets cities where they are. The second is that I think shifting from a kind of checklist of recommendations to much more attention to supporting city leaders and state leaders of cities in implementing in some of the boring, more mundane logistical details of moving from an intention to an action and outcome is another area where I think we could really help a lot. And I think those are a little bit less flashy, but at the same time, inviting city leaders to talk with mayors and engineers in our cities over a longer time period to see how they manage to finance different forms of wastewater, how they manage to deal with solid waste. Those are some of the kind of longer-term implementation collaboration that I think would really help. I think one of the things that India's cities have is they have incredibly smart people who are thinking through very complex problems. So in the state and city government, it's not that people don't know the problems, it's that the solutions they could learn a lot about these solutions from people who have dealt with those challenges of implementation before.
My guest on the show today is Jessica Seddon. Jessica is the global lead for air quality at the World Resources Institute here in Washington. She's also a non-resident fellow at CSIS and a research fellow at Princeton. Jessica, it's been great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Megan Maxwell and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Lauren Dueck is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.